everybody. Good afternoon. So tonight we are honored to have with us Dr. Jody David Armour. So Dr. Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. His expertise ranges from personal injury claims to claims about the relationship between racial justice, criminal justice, and the rule of law. Dr. Armour studies the intersection of race and legal decision-making and reform movements. Dr. Armour is a widely published scholar and a renowned lecturer, and he has published articles in Stanford Law Review, California Law Review, Ohio State Journal Law of Criminal Review, just to name a few. He has also appeared as a legal analyst on NBC, ABC, MSNBC, KPCC, and a variety of other television and news programs. Dr. Armour earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology from Harvard University and his JD degree from Boalt Law School of UC Berkeley. He currently teaches his students a diverse array of subjects, including criminal law, torts, stereotypes and prejudice, the role of cognitive unconscious in the rule of law. It is my honor to present to all of you Dr. Jody Armour, speaking on the unconscious bias, the social constructions of Black criminals.
Thanks very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to address you today about a subject that's near and dear to me. I've been grappling with for quite a few years now, and that is the subject of social perceptions, right? That's what we're talking about. Share with you a social perception of this Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC that she just described, right? I took my Roy P. Crocker self down to JW Marriott in downtown LA, and I was meeting my roommate from A Better Chance. I went through a program called A Better Chance, which targets inner city kids and puts them in boarding schools where they'll have a better chance to go on to college, et cetera. And I hadn't seen Lino Garcia in 25 years, so it's like opening a time capsule. He was the general manager of ESPN Deportes, so he'd come up, and I was just basking in his reflected glory, drinking a toast to innocence, a toast to time, 20 years later. And I was approached waiting in the lobby after we met, 3 guards, 2 white guards and a black guard. The reason that's significant is they sent the black guard over. And I was dressed like I am tonight without the tie. And the guard came up to me, the black guard came up to me, the 2 white ones standing further back. Social perceptions we're talking about, right? What does a Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law look like? He said, "Sir, are you here to see someone?" And I said, "Well, yes, but why aren't you asking anyone else in the lobby? If you've been down to JW Marriott, you see it's a big lobby teeming with people." He said, "Well, sir, we've been having a problem with transients." Right? The clear implication is I look like a transient to him, right? That's why he is not addressing other folks in the lobby and is addressing me. But as a lawyer, I wanted to actually hear him utter the words, right? I said, "So you're saying I look like a transient?" He said, "Sir, don't take it personally." All right, and then he went back and he joined the other 2 guards. At that point, we were just talking about new social media, and I'd been dragged into the 21st century kicking and screaming. This was a couple years ago by my students who said, "Professor Armour, you got to get on this Twitter and get with it." So I happened to be on at that point, so I started tweeting about this interaction. At the same time, the nice thing about teaching at a law school for 20 plus years now is a lot of your students are out practicing at law firms downtown, partners at those firms. So I called one at Latham & Watkins. I said, "Now I know he's not going to come back, but in case he does, I want you here on the phone." And I'm tweeting. I said, "I know it's not going to happen though, come on." He comes back. This time the other 2 guards are closer with him. He comes back and he says, "Sir, what is the name of the person, the guest you came here to see?" So as a both torts professor and criminal law professor, I can characterize that situation for you legally at that moment. What he was saying is, if I don't give them a name they can find in their database, I've assumed the ejectable status of a trespasser, and they were about to lay hands on me and throw me out of that lobby. All right, so that was the situation. And I was at that moment confronted with a situation that black folk in America are confronted with thousands of times a day, hundreds of thousands in some cases. This is the basic choice set that you have. This is the situation. Either I, one, give him the name Lino Garcia, validate his impressions of me, vindicate his assumptions about me, swallow that indignity, suffer that spirit murder. Either I do that, or option number two, and this is the only other option, I tell him to go fuck himself. This is the only other option. Either option is going to result in indignity. Right? This one is going to result with me in the back of a car. Right? And I'm probably not in front of you today because, on details of 6, USC law professor and legal analyst, ABC legal analyst, arrested for assault. Details of 6 and 11. That's option 2. That indignity. Or swallowing this indignity. And that is the pick your poison of many black folk on a daily basis. Right? And that is the stuff I wrote about in my first book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, the hidden cost of being black in America. That was based on some of the articles that you mentioned, from Stanford and Cal, et cetera, about unconscious bias in judging people, in assessing somebody's riskiness, dangerousness, an ambiguous figure. So profiling, in other words. So I did all of that. And then I had to think about another set of issues. And that's the one I want to talk to you about today. Not our biased social perceptions of blacks from the standpoint of their dangerousness, but our biased moral judgments of them. And they're two different questions. One has to do with profiling ambiguous people, making predictions about them. The other has to do with the problem of mass incarceration, the people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, most of whom have done the crimes they were charged with. So we're talking about wrongdoers who have done crimes, committed crimes, and now we have to make moral judgments of them and deciding how to blame and punish them. Because that's what I teach. When I teach criminal law, it's about blame and punishment. And the blame part is about moral judgment, subjective culpability. How wicked is the person? We want the punishment to fit the blame, punishment to fit the subjective culpability. That's the mens rea requirement. And so we make frontal assessments of the subjective culpability, the moral status of wrongdoers routinely as part of the criminal justice process. And I wanted to think about the implications of our moral judgments about people who are disproportionately black, because the people caught up in the criminal justice system are disproportionately black. So when you put a black face on crime, what does it trigger in social perceivers? What reactions do we have to folk who are caught up in the criminal justice system? What perceptions do we have of them? How do we view them? Right? So before I get to that particular question, I'll just back up for a moment and talk a little bit about the cognitive unconscious, where I'm going to be saying a lot of this stuff is coming from. Right? The cognitive unconscious is something I started writing about early in my career as an alternative to the Freudian model of the unconscious, which you had to be, if you believed in Freudian model, then it's convinced you. If you didn't, it wasn't empirically very convincing. The cognitive unconscious model of the unconscious let us really kind of zero in on social cognition, which is an information processing approach to human cognition. So we're able to kind of really zero in on how our brains operate when they were making judgments related to race. So we're able to say, here's your brain, here's your brain on race, right? And we're able to do that better and better with the kinds of brain imaging studies that we're doing now. We're really able to see your brain on race, right? And come to an understanding of our unconscious responses to people, the way our unconscious reflexes shape our perceptions of others, of members of social groups. So when I started writing about this cognitive unconscious, I had to help people first understand how it is possible that you could unconsciously do stuff, right? Because it's not intuitive that we do. So I had to, and so I'll share this with you now, to understand stereotypes. I call stereotypes, following the literature, well-learned, not just beliefs, well-learned sets of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness. That's a stereotype, a well-learned set of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness. I'll give you an example of a stereotype. Phyllis Katz in the New York Times describes a 3-year-old white girl who, upon seeing a black infant, says to her mom, "Look, Mom, a baby made." Right? Now, that 3-year-old little girl is not a racist. She's not a bigot. She's merely describing an association that's been forged in her memory between women from a certain social group and a social occupation she commonly sees them in. Right? She may reach the age of judgment and come to renounce that as an appropriate way to respond to women from that group. So her personal standards for how she ought to respond to the world may go one way, but she still has this association that's been forged in her memory, right? This well-learned set of associations that may be the basis of another set of responses unconsciously to her. So to understand how that kind of well-learned set of associations can drive us unconsciously, I just think of, oh, I'm not at home. Let me back up. When I think of that, I think of, wow, when I go to work, I live 10 minutes from my office at SC. I pull out of my driveway, I go down Crenshaw, MLK, I'm there. Fig, I'm there. And I, on numerous occasions, pulled out of my garage, and I could not tell you how I got to the garage at SC. It was all on automatic pilot. I was thinking about the lesson I was going to teach, and you're triggered to make turns and do things without any conscious attention, right? Without any conscious effort. That's how well-learned sets of associations work, right? William James said, we free our mind, our conscious mind, for survival activity if we can relegate to the unconscious realm well-learned sets of associations that can run automatically without all that extra cognitive energy, right? So, if indeed stereotypes are these well-learned sets of associations that can run automatically, let's say, just one more example so you can kind of understand how this works. I have 3 sons. My youngest just getting out of, he was recruited by the men's basketball team at Cal. And now another Akron, Ohio guy is coming here, LeBron James, all right, to resuscitate LA Laker basketball. But when I was teaching my youngest how to drive, every initial movement requires intention, attention, and effort, right? How to turn the wheel when you're hitting the gas versus hitting the brake. And man, I hate to say this, but when I taught all 3 of my boys how to drive sticks, we had to rent one. That was enterprise rental, because there was, initially the intent, there's a lot of there's a lot of learning. There's a learning curve until the sets of associations become subject to your not controlled processes, but automatic processes. Then, as well-learned sets of associations, I'm rolling down Fig with my boys, and we're debating healthcare reform, and they're just rolling along. Yeah, because all of this is now part of the cognitive unconscious. Well-learned sets of associations are like mental habits, right? Habits are just well-learned sets of associations that can run automatically without our conscious awareness. right? So how do you combat these stereotypes as well-learned sets of associations and run automatically without our conscious awareness? Becomes our next question. Can we combat them? And I suggest that we can, but it requires us to adopt a solution that runs counter to what many of us have learned. Many of us have learned that the way to address discrimination against members of stereotype groups, so when I talk about color blindness or color consciousness, I mean color to cover any marker marginality that people are stereotyped on the basis of, whether it's gender, LGBTQ status, ability status, whatever those bases of stereotypes are. Right? When we have these well-learned sets of associations about these members of these stereotype groups, we are often told that what we should do is ignore the fact that we're talking to a member of a stereotype group. Right? We should be color blind. We should be gender blind. We should be ability status blind. We should be in every way blind. Right? Goes back to Plessy Ferguson. Color blindness is the cold, or whatever variant, blindness. But if stereotypes are mental habits, well, right, what's the surest way to fall into a habit? Or what's the surest way not to break a habit? Is to ignore it when you're in the presence of environmental cues that trigger the habit. Think about biting your nails, for example. Let's say that's a habit, and you tend to do it when you're watching TV. Right? The one thing you do, one way you break that habit is when I'm in front of the TV, I call to mind my, commitment, my conviction, I'm going to break this habit. It takes intention, attention, and effort to resist succumbing to habitual responses. Right? So rather than color blindness, color consciousness is required in a lot of situations in which you may be subject to discriminating against a member of a stereotype group. That sounds counterintuitive, right, to us from a lot of our thinking about these issues or hearing about it from Plessy Ferguson in the legal arena or what have you, so much so that when I wrote one of my first articles, I had to argue against then standing legal doctrine that said you couldn't mention that factor in the courtroom without playing to the prejudices of the jury. They start, if you mention anything about the social identity of a litigant, you are playing to the prejudices of the jury. And so that was forbidden. And did people see the movie Philadelphia? And people see that? It was Tom Hanks was a young lawyer, and Denzel Washington was his attorney. And Hanks was discriminated against in his law firm because he was gay, and the partners didn't want a gay partner. And Denzel Washington character brings out in the courtroom the fact that his client is a member of the LGBTQ community, a gay particularly person, and tells the jury to confront that fact when they are looking at this fact pattern and grappling with this case, to resist succumbing to unconscious biases and to recognize what's really going on. And the judge interjects and says you can't mention that in the courtroom. So I took that on, and fortunately courts have started to resolve the issue differently now and do allow you to, even during voir dire, during jury questioning, start to challenge jurors to question their biases against certain outgroup members and, state their commitment, embrace their commitment to be neutral, to be as fair and objective and impartial as possible, and to resist succumbing to any kind of unconscious biases against whatever outgroup member may be a litigant in the case. So how does all of that cash out in the moral arena? Became my next question, and is what I really want to talk to you about today. That is, do we judge black hearts differently than similarly situated white hearts in the criminal justice process? Because the criminal justice process requires you to judge the heart of the offender. That's one of the things that, in my latest article that was read for Professor Keeley's class, I talk about how the mens rea requirement in a criminal case requires you to find two things. You have to find two things, one of which is the mens rea requirement. You have to find that the defendant committed a prohibited act, whatever that's the actus reus. Had to commit the prohibited act, then had to accompany that prohibited act has to be mens rea. That's subjective culpability, moral blameworthiness. That's how it works. And in establishing what is moral blameworthiness, the law, one of the formulations the law likes to use is a depraved heart, a depraved and malignant heart. They call it the depraved heart test, and they make it real clear that a big part of the moral judgment process that jurors have to go through is assessments of the character, the heart of the defendant, right? And then the question becomes, do black defendants get the same kind of moral judgments made of them as similarly situated white or other non-black defendants? It's an empirical question. It's a simple, right? It's straightforward, at some point, empirical question, right? It's kind of empirical in the way that another case of discrimination I'll connect it to before I come back to it. I have a colleague at Rossier School of Education at SC who's been teaching for years a course online. And he decided to run an experiment. He ran the same course, first with a male's name, his name, and then the next year with a woman's name. Same course. Online, controlled, can't see him or her. His evaluations, we're talking about student evaluations, his evaluations were jaw-droppingly worse as a woman. Jaw-droppingly worse. Right? That's how unconscious bias can affect your evaluation process. Right? That's an evaluation that we're talking about, like mens rea. You're making an evaluation of credit or blame. How much praise or blame to give someone. Those are flip sides of the same evaluative coin, right? And that shows you that there can be that kind of unconscious bias in how we evaluate people along gender lines. Well, along racial lines, I found the same kind of bias. Two kinds of biases I talk about in the article. One, attribution bias. Two, in-group empathy bias. Under attribution bias, here is the reasonable person test is at the heart of many legal doctrines, right? It's the quantity to which all is related, by which all is measured in the area of self-defense and in a lot of other areas, right? And the way the reasonable person test works is this. You ask the jury, would a reasonable person in the situation have done the same thing? If a reasonable person in the situation would have done the same thing, the defendant's excused, right? So we look at what an ordinary or typical or reasonable person in the situation would do. What the Model Penal Code points out is that to the extent that we attribute any act of wrongdoing to the situation, we mitigate or excuse. We say no liability or much less liability. To the extent that we attribute the wrongdoing to not the situation, but the character of the actor, we blame, we condemn, right? We want to punish. Okay, so that's basic attribution question, right? In attribution theory and social psychology, you'll find that it's talked about. This is a basic explanatory method that humans engage in. They either attribute human behavior to the situation or to the person. It's a basic split. What's interesting is they found, and I could name the study, I won't go into the details right now, I'll be glad to get into this more, that when you have black and white wrongdoers, that is, the subjects have concluded that both of them have done something they weren't supposed to do. This is Burt Duncan, the University of California study. They found with both these black and white wrongdoers, the subjects have said they were wrongdoers, they did something they weren't supposed to do. Then they asked them, to what do you attribute that wrongful act? To the character of the actor or to the situation? Because, it's like a case of road rage. Road rage, you can say, he's a hothead. Or you can say, I've had that happen too, it's human, it's kind of the situation there's a lot of situations in which you can go one way or the other. In fact, according to attribution theory and social psychology, that's what we do all the time routinely, and the reasonable person situation test is a legal vehicle that allows us to do that. So, the interesting thing they found is that there was a systematic tendency among the subjects to attribute the wrongdoing of the white actor to the situation and the wrongdoing of the black actor to his character. For the same act, right? The same violent act, the same wrongdoing. We've concluded that they were both all wrongdoers, violent, hostile act. Then they had to make an attribution judgment. Well, that attribution judgment is really a moral judgment, right? We see that. That's really that's what we say in the criminal law. To the extent that you can attribute the behavior to the situation, you excuse. You don't blame. To the extent that you attribute it to the character, you do blame. So really what the attribution judgment is doing is moral judgment work. Right? It's the basis for jurors to make moral judgments. And we see that there's a systematic tendency to attribute a wrongful act more often to a black wrongdoer's inner state, his or her heart, and attribute a white wrongdoer's behavior to his or her situation, to make more allowances for it, right? Which means you can have a black and white wrongdoer, both who do the exact same act. One will be found guilty of merely manslaughter, the other of murder, even though they did the same act on the basis of this differential attribution, right? In other words, criminals are constructed, not just found in the fact-finding process of trials, right? There's an active construction going on in the mental processes of the jurors when they're looking at different litigants coming before them and having to make moral assessments of them. I'll give you one other example. The Model Penal Code talks about the reasonable person test as essentially being a vehicle by which the jury can express sympathy or empathy with the defendant. In other words, to the extent that you sympathetically identify with the defendant, you will find what he or she did reasonable. To the extent that you don't, you will not find it reasonable, right? So it's a vehicle for sympathy. Well, there's a whole set of studies we talked about in Professor Keeley's class today. That's in my latest article. There's a whole set of studies that, again, here's your brain on race. Here it is. Here are these brain imaging studies in which they look at what a person who's observing another person drink, for example, a cup of water. If you watch another person drink a cup of water, your mirror neurons are going to fire and you're going to simulate in your own mind what you're seeing. You're not actually going to bring your hand up to your mouth, but in your mirror neurons, through your mirror neurons, you're going to simulate it in your own mind, right? That's one of the basic building blocks of sympathy and empathy. Vicarious experiences, reason you squint in movie theaters and things like that. But what the studies found when they got a little more granular is that if you are a white person who's watching another white person drink a cup of coffee or a glass of water, your mirror neurons fire. You simulate what you see. If you're watching a black person drink a cup of water, there's no activity in the mirror neurons. Your brain on race. The basic building blocks of empathy and sympathy aren't firing, aren't there, right? And I think that can explain a lot. That goes towards explaining a lot. To me, that explains a lot about, for example, the response to Hurricane Katrina in the 9th Ward, right? When you had black folks in New Orleans, 9th Ward, standing on rooftops with literally the water up to their chest. And here's the cameras beaming down on them. And 4 days in, Sean Penn is rowing up in a rowboat handing out fresh water because FEMA still couldn't get its act together, right? That was Hurricane Katrina. Compare that response to the response to 9/11, right? There was a panic of empathy. They just got it done. There was no talk about any bureaucratic red tape. There was just the panic of empathy, get it done. Right? Look at what's happening to Puerto Rico now. It's a kind of current day example of Katrina. Right? Once you otherize in some way the victims, those who are suffering that plight, then there's not the basic building blocks for empathy aren't there. You don't have that panic of empathy. Yeah, maybe you feel some sympathy, but there's not that panic of empathy that comes from really deeply sympathetically identifying with the people who are in distress. And so this same phenomenon goes into the reasonable person test and asks the jurors, do you sympathetically identify with the defendant? To the extent that you do, you'll find what the defendant did reasonable. To the extent that you don't, you won't find it reasonable. And now we know there's a cognitive basis for people finding out-group members less sympathetic than in-group members, and therefore less reasonable, therefore more culpable, more blameworthy. See, blame isn't turning on categorical imperatives. Moral judgments aren't turning on, whether you're adhering to some moral code. It's turning on things like, do I sympathetically identify with you? Do I want to make allowances for your ordinary human frailty? Do I see myself in you? How can I blame you if you're just like me? Right? When people want to understand what happened in the, for example, Trayvon Martin case, here's what happened. People come up with a lot of explanations that I think actually can confuse the issue. What happened is the judge instructed the jury in the way the judges instruct the juries in self-defense cases in general. And that instruction says, using the reasonable person test, if a reasonable person in the situation would have felt fear, you will excuse. In other words, the judge told the jury, go back in the deliberation room, gaze into a looking glass. If you see George Zimmerman looking back at you, acquit. Right? When they saw George Zimmerman looking back at them, when they sympathetically identified with him, when they couldn't differentiate themselves from him, they acquitted because that's what they're supposed to do under the law. Right? The jury box can just be a conduit for ordinary social beliefs, prevailing social attitudes, ordinary social expectations. They just come right on in the jury, right on in the courtroom, right through the jury box. We really get into this also not only when we're talking about race, but sexual assault, when I get to that in my criminal law class. It's the same process because a reasonable person is right at the center of everything again. Was the mistake reasonable as to consent? How do we define reasonable? Right, we come right back to it. Combating it, what are the implications of all of this? I think there are a number of implications that come to mind for me immediately. One, above all, is epistemic humility about our moral judgments of others. Generally, I think, catching it when it comes to this stereotype group, black, socially marginalized, one of the most maligned and marginalized in American history. Yes, that gives us some important insight, but I think even more insight can be gained from recognizing the ways that it also calls into question more generally the objectivity and neutrality of our blaming and punishing practices. We're starting to critically self-reflect on that as a country in the last, 8 years or so in a way we haven't for a long time. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow came out, and a lot of people who used to look at black as wrongdoers in general and disproportionately black, they didn't look at them as a social justice issue. They just looked at that as an issue of people making bad choices. Not a social justice issue. Right? But for the last 8 years, we've started to critically self-reflect on that in a way that we haven't. And so this approach that I'm suggesting is counseling epistemic humility about our ability to really judge the just deserts of another. Because you got to be pretty damn sure that you know exactly what the just deserts of another are if you're going to put their life out in capital punishment, for example. Right? Or put them in a cage, like when I take my students up to San Quentin, a 6x9 cage, stuff 2 of them in there and keep them in there sometimes for 2-3 days at a time. And limit how many times they can flush the toilet because of water issues. Right? You have to be pretty damn sure of your moral contempt for those people to treat them like that, to otherize them in that way, and treat them like that. And this, what I'm talking about, that's coming out of the empirical psychology, is that our moral judgments aren't pristine, aren't necessarily at all bias-free in a whole variety of ways. And so maybe we should think twice about draconian punishments being extremely punitive. When I was talking down at in San Pedro at Terminal Island at the federal prison down there to guards about unconscious bias, they took me out and were giving me a tour of the grounds, and I saw this big expanse of asphalt, and I said, man, I expected a big parking lot there. I said, but I'm not seeing any cars there. I said, what's going on there? They said, well, the people from back in East D.C. came out for a visit, and they saw the grass and the trees out there, and they said, what's the grass and trees doing out there? The prisoners shouldn't be able to look at grass and trees. Right? So they uprooted the trees and paved over the grass. Because that's how we thought. In the California Code, we said the point of the criminal sanction in California is punishment. We went away from rehabilitation. We said punishment. Right? That was a conscious decision. Right? But in saying that your goal is punishment, you're kind of saying that the retributive urge you're feeling, it's justified to act on that retributive urge. You can trust that retributive urge. You just want to punish. You want to inflict as much pain and suffering as it takes, because it doesn't really matter, because they are not really people who are morally worthy of our consideration. Morally worthy. The example that comes to mind to make that point is something else we talked about in class today. My Twitter handle comes from, which is nigger theory. And I was talking in class about how that's caused picket signs to erupt at some talks I was given by N-word abolitionists. Right? But where I'm pulling that word from is a moral distinction invited and made by one of the most popular comedians in popular culture, in which he launched his comedic career. Chris Rock launched his comedic career on the basis of this routine in which he's walking back and forth in front of, it used to be in all these households I went in, black households especially. You had this Chris Rock cut in there somewhere. Chris Rock walking back and forth in front of an all-black audience saying, let me get pretty roughly to it, something like, it's like a civil war going on in black America, and there's two sides. There's black people and there's niggas. And niggas have got to go. I love black people, but I hate niggas. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Shit, I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. And he keeps on like that for 45 minutes. And the crowd is falling out in their seats, right? And his core distinction between lovable black people and condemnable niggas is criminality, right? A nigga is a black person who does crime. That's his core definition, core criterion, right? By that logic, That latest article that you shared with your class, by that logic, because they asked me to pinpoint cite this professor, they said, man, this just seems like it's hyperbolic. We're going to have pinpoint cite. They got the pinpoint cite up to 90% of young black males in some of our inner city neighborhoods are going to wind up in jail, on probation, on parole at some point in their lives. So what somebody like Chris Rock and those from that politics of respectability school are saying is that up to 90% of our own children are niggas. That's the logic. Right? That conclusion should sufficiently impeach any logic on which it rests. Right? But it is a popular logic. It is the one that somebody like, Bill Cosby. Let's name names. Right? In 2004, Bill Cosby was part of the politics of respectability school, in which he was saying, don't confuse me with them. And he was wagging his fingers. He did a famous pound cake speech. And when you got the NAACP Image Award, in which he said people were crying about that black kid getting shot in the head over the pound cake. Well, why did he steal the pound cake? I've been hungry. I've seen the pound cake. I didn't take it. You know why? It's something called upbringing. That's Bill Cosby talking about he's slipping roofies into women's drinks. That's not still debated, is it? 50, 60 women in? At some point you're turning into a climate denier or evolution denier or something. Right? But that was the attitude of a lot of the politics of respectability folk. And it's still there, and it's rooted in a certainty about moral distinctions. I know good Negroes versus bad Negroes, and I don't have any problem with having corrosive contempt for the bad ones. That's Randy Kennedy in his book, Race, Crime, and Law, 1997, black Harvard law professor. He says the black community needs to start distinguishing between good Negroes and bad Negroes. He uses Chris Rock's distinction, only he states it in the more genteel language of the academy. Good Negroes versus bad Negroes. Right? But says the exact same thing, and in fact is able to trace it to folks like, Thurgood Marshall. And I'm sorry, I'm going to step on some toes now, but Barack Obama, he was a big politics of respectability proponent. Went to Morehouse and wagged his finger at them about not making excuses, but didn't go to Ohio State and said, don't make excuses. But told these black youth who had shown a lot of personal responsibility getting to graduation day, don't go out there and make excuses. Because our people are prone to making excuses. Where's that coming from? That's politics of respectability. Right? And it's rooted in our moral perceptions, our perceptions of others. And it's showing that even people who are on the receiving end of stereotypes can use those stereotypes against members of their own group. I live on a street called Kenway in an area called View Park, which the LA Times has called the Black Beverly Hills. You take View Park, put it together with Baldwin Hills, Windsor Hills, and Ladera Heights, you have the largest contiguous upper middle class and upper class neighborhood in the country. And I've had neighbors on my street come to me and say, because my sons, I didn't limit my sons to Jack and Jill social clubs. We had them all over LA in the Southland, AAU basketball, Little League football, Pop Warner football, Little League baseball, AAU basketball. And they made friends from lots of different neighborhoods, lots of places. When those friends would come to visit them, I've had neighbors in my black Beverly Hills neighborhood come to me and say, we don't want Compton up here. I've had sheriff's deputies come to my event planner and say, we don't want South Central up here, even though we live in South Central. But it's another example of how groups, even within a group, and the irony to me is, here are some people, this black bourgeoisie, these upper middle class blacks, who rail against racial profiling. In Ellis Coe's book, The Rage of a Privileged Class, he talks about black middle class who are enraged because they're constantly being profiled, despite their medical degrees, despite their law degrees, despite their income, they're constantly being profiled. So he talks about that. The irony is, here's a group of my neighbors, who were railing against racial profiling, but practicing spatial profiling against members of their own group without any sense of irony at all. Class profiling's okay, I guess. Nigger theory. Let's talk a little bit more about that, Professor Keeley, because now we get to talk about how these perceptions play into the debate about free speech on campus. We just had someone named Ben Shapiro come to our campus. And say some very uncomfortable things about stuff we're talking about today. And students protested, there were demonstrations. But he spoke in Bovard Auditorium. And people called me a sellout and may call me one now because I supported his right to speak. And I supported his right to speak because I can't separate his right to speak from my right to be able to expound nigger theory the way I do. I provoked picket lines at a number of venues I've spoken at by N-word abolitionists who've come out and said that that's a blood-soaked epithet, that it's tainted fruit whose roots run into a racist past, and so it's a form of hate speech. Right? And so for you to get up here and use that language is to normalize it and to traumatize. Right? And they didn't want to hear about any connections to Pac, Nas, Cube, Hove. No, they don't want to hear any of that. NAACP buried the N-word in Detroit in 2006 in Freedom Plaza. Remember that? They buried it, brought it through the streets with a casket, wooden casket, and had a eulogy over it. Julian Bond and Kirkpatrick. And as we talked about in class, miraculously the next morning, like Lazarus, it rose again. I heard it in popular culture. I heard my son spanning it, throwing it back and forth. Right, but I have had folks who feel very strongly in that way say, I'm going to demonstrate your talk and demonstrate against it. And I have stood 100% behind them. I've said, number one, I'm 100% behind your right to demonstrate my talk. That's your expression of your freedom of speech. That's your freedom of expression. Freedom of political expression, freedom of association, freedom of speech, lots of things, that's yours. And I respect it and I salute it because it's going to deepen, I think, the discussion ultimately, and does. But on the other hand, they did allow me to speak. So there was that compromise. I was allowed to speak. I was allowed to share my views. And I asked some of those folks who had attended the talk to be the first one to ask questions. I wanted to hear, those tough questions right off the bat. So knowing how easy it is to label someone a black identity extremist, which Karen Bass pointed out was a problem in the congressional floor, how just expressing your Black Lives Matter sympathies could get you labeled by the FBI as a black identity extremist. And for lots of other reasons having to do with, like Ice Cube, when I interviewed Ice Cube for one of my plays, he said, when I uttered the words, "Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad because I'm brown and not the other color, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority." When I uttered those words, the police said they would come out and cuff me and lock me up, and that's what they did. Came out and cuffed him and locked him up. So I just see the speech restrictions coming down disproportionately on marginalized dissidents. I'm reluctant to give any authority more tools against dissidents, especially from marginalized groups. Right? So that's why, and I can't draw a clear distinction between me and Ben Shapiro. I really can't. You know I'm not saying what Ben Shapiro is saying in a lot of ways, but some people could say, look, Armour, you're not kneeling during you're not standing up during the national anthem, you're kneeling and supporting Kaepernick. I find that just as odious as what some people on the other side find about Ben Shapiro. How am I going to be able to distinguish those cases? Except by saying, oh, well, there's a difference between domination and subordination. That can get awfully, let me tell you as a lawyer, that can get awfully slippery as a basis, as a principal basis for saying, one group can speak freely, but another can't. Now, does that mean it's okay with me for somebody to say, hey, I want to express my freedom of expression and come into the classroom wearing a KKK hood and sit down in the classroom? No, I got to draw the line. I'm going to say that the subject is nuanced and complicated. I can't give you any sound bites. I don't think you can reduce this subject to sound bites that you can slap on bumper stickers or stitch on throw pillows or paint on the side of a barn. I mean, it's a complicated discussion. It's a nuanced, difficult discussion. But again, turns on how we talk about our different social perceptions, how we get in the same room and say, we're going to have some discussions about things like social perceptions and social biases and unconscious biases, and we're going to make that the center of our inclusion, diversity, and equity efforts. But we're also going to do it in a way that allows people to say unpopular things and allows people to stick their foot in their mouths. Because one of the ways I've learned through my life is by sticking my foot in my mouth. That's been a good teacher. I stick my foot in my mouth and I learn. I learn not to stick my foot in my mouth again. I do. I go back and I think that through. So that, when we're talking about this subject of different social perceptions and unconscious bias and, the different ways it affects us and cuts, I hope that we do it in that spirit that allows for, not so much safe space, although safe space is very important. And I'm a big proponent of safe space for homelands, of places to go, to just be away from the constant. I understand that, but I'm also a big proponent of what they call brave spaces. Where we come together and have tough conversations, uncomfortable conversation, put it out there, and allow one another to make mistakes. I had one of my students, a law student, black woman. She was defending client in one of our hypos in class, and she said, well, I would consider race in assessing someone's dangerousness myself, and I'm a black woman. That haunted her for the rest of her law school life. And even after, I'm out there now, years later, there are classmates who'll bring up that somebody said something so impolitic. Right? You can't have a conversation if people are going to say that anytime you say something that is viewed as inappropriate. Because that's how we learn. If we trust one another anyway, and I guess that's the real thing. Do we trust one another? Man, I'm gonna stop it at this and then take questions. I love the community I've seen here at Pitzer. I wish I had come here sooner. This seems like it's a small enough community where you can develop that kind of trust. I worry about the bigger institutions. We give it the lip service, but it's hard to do that on that mass scale. But it really feels like you can have enough trust here to have those really difficult conversations. That's my impression anyway. But I'll take questions.